It started as an ordinary day in the park, a quiet space where people sought peace and relaxation. Among them was an elderly black woman, her white cane tapping gently along the path as she made her way to her favorite bench. She was blind, but carried herself with a grace and confidence that spoke volumes about her resilience. But her day took a drastic turn when a white officer approached her, his tone sharp and his demeanor anything but kind. She had unknowingly paused in an area he deemed off-limits, and instead of offering assistance or understanding, he grew impatient. What happened next left everyone around in shock. With little explanation, the officer grabbed her cane and snapped it in two, dismissing her protests as he scolded her for not following his orders. The sound of the cane breaking echoed in the park, drawing the attention of bystanders who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The woman sat frozen, her hands trembling as she tried to comprehend the situation. To the officer, she was just another person to reprimand, someone he assumed wouldn't fight back. What he didn't realize, however, was that this seemingly defenseless woman had a powerful connection. Her son was not just any man, he was a well-respected police captain in the very same city. As murmurs began to spread through the park, one of the onlookers discreetly made a phone call, explaining what had just happened. Meanwhile, the officer remained oblivious to the storm brewing. The woman, though visibly shaken, composed herself and sat silently waiting. Little did the officer know that his actions had set in motion a chain of events that would turn the tables in ways he could never have imagined. The air in the park grew heavy with tension as all eyes watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer's arrogance seemed to grow as he stood over the elderly woman, oblivious to the whispers and glares from onlookers. He believed he was enforcing the rules, yet his actions revealed a troubling disregard for empathy. The woman, despite her visible frustration, remained composed. She had lived long enough to know that anger wouldn't solve anything, but her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. She sat there, fingers lightly brushing the splintered remains of her cane, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just occurred. Her thoughts weren't about herself, though. They were about her son, who had always warned her about situations like this. Her son, Captain Marcus Taylor, was known throughout the city as a firm but fair leader. He had spent years earning the respect of his community and his officers, working tirelessly to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. He often worried about his mother's independence, knowing her refusal to let blindness slow her down made her vulnerable in a world that wasn't always kind. What would Marcus think when he heard about this? The thought brought her both comfort and anxiety. The park crowd had grown thicker, a mix of silent witnesses and those subtly recording the scene on their phones. One man, who had called Marcus, paced anxiously nearby, waiting for a response. The officer remained oblivious, his posture rigid, as if he were proud of what he'd done. He turned away from the woman, addressing the growing crowd with authority, trying to justify his actions. But as the minutes ticked by, his confidence began to falter. There was a shift in the air, a growing tension that even he couldn't ignore. Somewhere, someone was approaching, and everything was about to change. The crowd watched in tense silence as the officer continued pacing, his voice firm but clearly defensive as he addressed a few murmured protests. He insisted he was simply maintaining order, but his words fell flat. The elderly woman remained seated, her quiet resilience speaking louder than any argument she could make. The man who had called Marcus paced a few feet away, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He had spoken quickly, his voice urgent, but he wasn't sure if Marcus had heard the gravity of the situation. All he could do now was wait. Meanwhile, a young woman in the crowd, a local activist named Leah, began recording the entire scene. She recognized the woman and knew her story. This wasn't just anyone. This was a woman who had spent decades as a pillar of the community, organizing food drives, mentoring youth, and supporting families in need. Leah's frustration bubbled over as she captured the officer's dismissive demeanor. She knew this video could expose a deeper issue, but she also knew it could put the woman at risk. Still, she couldn't stand by without doing something. As Lee recorded, another man in the crowd quietly approached the woman, kneeling beside her. He introduced himself softly and asked if she was okay. She nodded, her calm demeanor unwavering, but her grit on the broken cane revealed the pain and frustration she held back. The man offered to help her up, but she declined, saying, "Let's just wait a little longer." The officer's confidence began to waver as more eyes focused on him, and whispers in the crowd grew louder. He glanced over his shoulder, uneasy but unwilling to admit he might have overstepped. The tension thickened as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the distance. A tall figure emerged from the park entrance, his stride purposeful, his expression unreadable. Marcus Taylor had arrived. Marcus Taylor's arrival sent a ripple through the crowd. Dressed sharply in his police captain's uniform, his presence commanded immediate attention. People murmured as they recognized him, their hushed voices blending into the tension hanging heavy in the air. The officer, still holding the broken cane, turned to see Marcus approaching. His confident stance faltered slightly as he realized who was heading toward him, but he quickly composed himself, standing straighter, as if preparing to defend his actions. Marcus's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the shattered cane in the officer's hand, the woman still seated calmly on the bench, and the uneasy crowd surrounding them. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried an intensity that silenced the whispers. He approached his mother first, kneeling beside her and gently touching her hand. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked softly, his voice steady but filled with concern. She nodded and gave him a small smile, but her grip on his hand tightened briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's weight. The officer cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "Captain Taylor, I wasn't aware this woman was related to you," he stammered, his earlier confidence slipping. "There was a misunderstanding. She was uncooperative, and I had to act." Marcus stood, his imposing figure now face to face with the officer. The calm in his voice was more unsettling than anger. "Uncooperative. She's blind, officer. What part of that made you think breaking her cane was necessary?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, and the crowd grew even quieter, straining to hear every word. The officer hesitated, the weight of his actions dawning on him as Marcus's question remained unanswered. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of sirens growing louder in the background. Marcus took a step closer, his voice lower but firm. "You don't just owe her an explanation. You owe her an apology." The officer's face paled as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The crowd watched with bated breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. Just as the officer stammered out an apology, a new voice broke through the tense atmosphere. "Wait a second." A woman in casual attire stepped forward from the crowd, holding her phone up like it was a badge of authority. "I recorded everything," she announced, her tone equal parts defiant and determined. The officer's face turned a shade paler, and even Marcus turned to look at her with interest. The crowd stirred, realizing the gravity of her words. The woman tapped on her phone, ready to play back the video. "It wasn't just the cane," she added, addressing Marcus. "This officer harassed your mother, Captain, called her names, accused her of things she didn't do. Everyone needs to see what really happened." The officer's composure shattered completely as murmurs of shock and anger spread. "That's not true," he protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus's expression tightened, but he remained silent, letting the woman continue. She pressed play, and the air filled with the sound of a recorded confrontation. The officer's voice was unmistakable, laced with hostility and contempt. The crowd's mood shifted from quiet curiosity to righteous outrage. Gasps echoed as the recording revealed not just the officer's disrespect, but a comment that hinted at a deeper prejudice. Marcus's jaw clenched, his silence more powerful than words as he absorbed the revelation. The officer, now visibly sweating, tried to explain, but the crowd wasn't interested in excuses anymore. Then came the twist no one expected. Another officer arrived on the scene, stepping out of a patrol car with a stern look. But instead of greeting Marcus or the officer in question, he addressed the crowd. "This isn't the first time we've received complaints about him," he announced, pointing at the officer holding the broken cane. His words sent shockwaves through the gathering. The stakes had just risen, and now the problem was much bigger than a single incident. As the second officer's words hung in the air, Marcus took a step forward, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs. His voice was firm but controlled as he addressed the officer who had broken his mother's cane. "Officer Daniels," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the tension, "you've not only disrespected my mother, but dishonored the badge you wear. This behavior won't be tolerated, not in this precinct, not under my leadership." The crowd erupted in applause, their faith in justice briefly restored. But before the officer could respond, the woman who had filmed the incident interjected again, holding up another phone. "There's more," she said, her voice shaking slightly with the weight of what she was about to reveal. The screen lit up with another video, this time showing Officer Daniels in a different setting, harassing another elderly resident in the same park a week earlier. The revelation was met with a collective gasp from the crowd, and Daniels visibly crumbled under the mounting evidence. Marcus turned to the second officer. "Escort him to the station. Effective immediately, he's relieved of duty pending a full investigation." The officer nodded, gripping Daniels by the arm as the disgraced man muttered weak protests, his bravado completely shattered. As the situation seemed to resolve, a final twist surfaced. The woman with the recordings revealed her connection to Marcus's mother, a former student of hers from decades ago. "She taught me everything I know about standing up for myself," the woman said, her eyes welling up. "It's only right I stand up for her now." Marcus's mother, who had remained composed throughout, finally broke her silence. "Justice isn't about revenge," she said softly, addressing the crowd. "It's about accountability and growth. Let this be a lesson for all of us." With that, the tension dissolved, leaving behind a sense of closure and a reminder of the power of integrity. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. Marcus walked over to his mother, who remained seated calmly on the bench, her broken cane still lying beside her. He knelt down, gently taking her hand. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said softly. "But you handled it with more grace than anyone else ever could." She gave him a small smile, her strength shining through despite the ordeal. Meanwhile, the woman who had recorded the events stayed behind, ensuring Marcus's mother was comfortable. She promised to send the videos directly to the department for the investigation. "People like her," the woman said, nodding toward Marcus's mother, "make this world better. And people like you make sure that those who harm others face the consequences." By the next morning, Officer Daniels' suspension had been publicly announced, with an internal review underway. Marcus took it upon himself to ensure proper training and community workshops were implemented for his precinct, aimed at fostering respect and understanding between officers and residents. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, one rooted in change. Marcus returned to his mother's home later that evening with a surprise, a custom cane with her initials engraved on the handle. "This is just a small way to thank you," he said as he handed it to her. She chuckled, tapping it lightly on the floor. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice steady. "But remember, Marcus, the real strength isn't in this cane. It's in how you choose to carry yourself every day." As they sat together, the day's events became a story of resilience and accountability. It was a reminder that even in moments of injustice, standing together could light the way forward.